Today I'm going to talk about 3 books that were not love at first sight, but I soon fell in love with. And I'm also going to, for good measure, going to talk about one item that I quickly fell out of love with. The reason I'm going to talk about it in this way is because this series of book videos is meant for somebody getting into the business of book selling or to have some insights into the mind of a rare book dealer. And I think it's important to understand when someone like me purchases books at an estate or an auction, I'm not 100% head over heels immediately enthralled by everything that I buy. And I'm certainly not 100% knowledgeable about everything that I buy. But it's the act of sitting down and cataloging the books, examining the physical copies in my hand rather carefully, and setting them in their historical context that I really start either to fall in love with the books or quickly fall out of love with them and have to sell them as soon as possible. So let's look at some volumes that I fell in love with but were not in love with at first. This first set is rather shabby 3-volume set, and right there is a reason why I wouldn't be in love with it at first. Many times at book fairs, I should say, people are quickly walking by and they gravitate and their eye catches rather glamorous looking volumes, whether it's an Art Deco binding or a Vanessa Bell dust jacket on a Virginia Woolf first edition, and their eyes pass over shelves of old and dusty books. So I said to myself, for commercial reasons, I should start to stay away from some of these old, dusty little volumes that are not necessarily visually appealing. But, of course, I can't. Another thing about this set is that it was called the Abbess, which I had a little bit of a theological tone to it, so I sort of ignored that. And it was printed in Baltimore in 1801, and when I Googled that, it wasn't even a first edition, which was printed in 1799 in London. And when a bookseller hears something is not a first edition, it's like getting struck by lightning 3 times, I would say. You immediately recoil. However, when I sat down then to catalog the books, I quickly fell in love. And one of the first things I noticed was the author of the book, which I'm ashamed to admit I didn't even see before, and that's William Henry Ireland. Now, I'm very familiar with William Henry Ireland. He was the son of the antiquarian Samuel Ireland, who filled his house with antique curios. And the story goes when William Henry was probably about 19, he came upon a box or a chest that was filled with poems and manuscripts, all in the hand, supposedly, of William Shakespeare himself. Now, this created quite a sensation in England during the period. And he was exposed in 1796 as a great forger for having perpetrated one of the greatest Shakespearean, if not literary, hoaxes of all time, which was truly remarkable, not just because of the papers he produced, but even more so, they weren't very competent forgeries. They were forensically implausible, hurriedly written, but the scholars were so gullible, they believed these were true Shakespearean manuscripts. And I love that psychological aspect to the art of forgery, where it really doesn't depend so much on the quality of the forgery, but the gullibility, let's say, the need to believe on the part of the victim. So quite familiar with the story of William Henry Ireland, but I was not familiar with his Gothic fiction. I'm a little ashamed to say so because when I Wikipedia'd it, it said that this set is considered one of the most salacious and voluptuous tales of the 18th century. Now, what bookseller does not want to hear the words salacious and voluptuous? And the next thing I read was actually a Goodreads review of a modern edition of it, and it said, "It's a monastic shocker of sex and slaughter." And I'm just reading verbatim here because I was so excited about it. "The Abbess is a tale about the unspeakable agonies of medieval torture perpetrated in dank subterranean burial chambers. Marilina Rosa and Marcello Porta fight against the dark schemes and direful machinations of secret enemies and menacing parents in a tale of love and passion, where nothing is as it seems, and amid the hungry rats and the well-used racks, amid the restraining chain and shackle poles, amid the thumb screws and branding irons, is the sadistic and sexually insatiable architect of the House of Horrors, Vittorio Bracciano, otherwise known as the Abbess." Now, who would not be reeled in by that description there? I also then started to read the book, besides the salacious passages, the preface was quite interesting, and you could see it play directly into the Shakespearean forgeries. And William Henry Ireland is clearly nervous about his reception and sullied reputation, and he supposedly overhears people talking derisively, a little bit like a David Sedaris conversation where it says, "Oh, the author of those papers," referring to the Shakespearean papers. And he writes, "I was just standing at the door, holding the knob in my hand and ready to turn it when my ear caught the above words." So he's very sensitive to the reception of the work and gossip about him. But he still had the gumption to include Shakespearean quotes in many of the chapter headings from The Gentleman of Verona or The Tempest. Now, one thing I started to really appreciate is that this is an American edition. The first thing I did, of course, was run over to Rare Book Hub, one of the auction databases, to see if this was ever offered for sale. And I discovered the first edition from 1799 is a true literary rarity. It hasn't appeared since the 1970s and sold for quite a sum then. And there were no records of this American edition, which is always warming to a bookseller's heart. Another exciting thing about the American edition, at least in my mind, is I learned that this work had tremendous influence on one of my favorite writers, Edgar Allan Poe. And I could imagine Poe would have had much easier access to this American edition than its London counterpart. The American edition also contains a rather remarkable list of subscribers to the volume at the end. Hundreds of people surprisingly subscribed to this rather sordid and salacious tale, including very prominent people such as Thomas Jefferson himself, believe that or not. This particular copy, as I said, because you sit down and examine all the physical attributes, is extremely interesting as well. It contains some early American book plates, one from a bookseller, Jacob Dietrich, from an ironmongery paint book and fancy store. I wrote on Instagram, and if you're not following me, follow me, that I now not only want a bookstore, but I want a book and fancy store. There's also the inscription of an early woman owner, Mary Zipporah Baker, her book, 1822, and she writes, the first volume of an excellent novel. So I love that little tidbit where she's written that it's an excellent novel. So you can understand how quickly then I could fall in love with this little brown set, The Abbess. So that is book number 1 there. Let's move on then to another book that I was not in love with at first, but now I am quite fond of. And the book is an Elizabethan book printed in 1574. Now, who could not be in love with an Elizabethan book across the room? But it is the Sermons of John Calvin, translated into English. Now, I am not a particularly great fan of the reformer John Calvin. Maybe I like Calvin and Hobbes. But when I sat down to catalog this, at the bottom of the epistle dedicatory, I noticed that it was translated into English by Arthur Golding. Now, I am a big fan of Arthur Golding, and he was a very famous Elizabethan translator who translated at least 30 books from Latin into English. And I'm particularly fond of him, I would say, because of my friend Dan Wexler at Sanctuary Books, who brought him to my attention years ago. And Dan has a fabulously interesting book called The Beehive, if you haven't seen it online, about his discovery of an annotated Elizabethan dictionary. So I was very familiar with Arthur Golding. Now, Golding was very well known, especially for his translation in 1567 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Scholars today believe that that translation was Shakespeare's favorite book, largely because of its influence upon some of his narratives, but also because you can see clear verbal echoes between Golding's use of language and that employed by Shakespeare. So a very important Shakespeare source book. Now, there are other traditional Shakespearean source books as well that Shakespeare clearly relied upon. For instance, Holinshed's Chronicle or The Lives of Plutarch. And these are well known, But I think that books that were not necessarily Shakespearean source book, but contain these verbal echoes are equally interesting. Now, if you wanted a copy of Golding's translations of Ovid, if you could find that, it's a very rare book these days in commerce, it would be very expensive. But a book like this, even though it's not a book that Shakespeare directly relied upon, it's still a Golding translation. And I think that gives a much more affordable entry into the language that certainly influenced Shakespeare. So I started to really love the book for that particular reason. Another wonderful thing about it is the title page. Now, a lot of Elizabethan books have these very simple geometric title pages, I would say, which certainly appeal to me, but this one has a rather delightful Italian Baroque ornate title page, and it's printed by Lucas Harrison and George Bishop, who were well known for printing at I think it was the Sign of the Brazen Serpent, a famous Elizabethan printing establishment. And you can see incorporated into this ornate title page various brazen serpents. So any book that contains brazen serpents and the language of Arthur Golding that had an influence upon Shakespeare is certainly a book that I can fall in love with. Finally, my third item here is a document, a single page. Now, when I purchased this, I did not know how important it was. And now I've come to realize that this is one of the most important documents that I've been privileged to handle in years, I would say, of great importance to the history of the United States and the history of California. Well, how could I possibly not know that when I purchased it? And I certainly paid money for it. The reason was I bought it because it was signed by John Sutter, famous for the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, of course, which almost every school kid knows, and the beginning of the California gold rush. Now, I was not totally in love with it because I said to myself, for commercial reasons, well, I think John Sutter is a very important name in American history, but he doesn't have the cachet necessarily of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln that's going to catch those quick glances of passerbys at the New York Book Fair looking at a case. So I questioned, am I going to be able to sell a John Sutter document? But when I sat down to actually examine it, I realized that this is a document of extraordinary importance in my mind. The first thing I noticed about it is it's California, 1847, territory of California, but it's written under the umbrella of the United States of America. Now, California was not admitted to statehood for another 3 years, and this is one of the earliest known documents where the territory of California is under that United States of America umbrella. Now, it is for a jury summons, which I knew when I purchased it, but I did not examine what the trial was itself. And the trial is really fascinating. The story goes that there was about 60 miles north of Sutter's farm, there was a massacre against the Native Americans. At first, the white settlers were favorably received, but they soon turned against their hosts. And when some tried to escape after being enslaved, they were murdered, women and children. And John Sutter heard about these terrible depredations against the natives, and he helped bring to justice the 3 perpetrators of that horrid massacre. And this is the original jury summons for that famous trial. And the list of prospective jurors is absolutely remarkable. It's practically a who's who of pre-Gold Rush California. Everybody on here is an important early settler, practically many famous names with long histories associated with them in a period where California was, of course, very sparsely populated before the gold rush. Another remarkable thing is this is probably the last American military trial for slavers of Native Americans. And unfortunately, after this trial, the genocide, especially in California, continued and was a black stain, certainly on the state of California, and a black stain on the history of the United States. But I have a lot of reverence for this very important document. I want it to be placed in a proper institution where it can be really studied and appreciated, because it certainly does not belong in my hands. I don't really feel that I'm worthy sometimes of holding these fabulous things in my hands. but this is certainly a document that I fell in love with through the act of cataloging and studying it and placing it in its historical context. And I will, by the way, be bringing this to, I should say, the New York Antiquarian Fair, so I hope you guys will stop by and visit in April, so that's coming up soon. And finally, I promised something that I fell out of love with, and here we go, and there we are. It is a document signed by none other than the 16th president himself, an original signature of Abraham Lincoln. Now you're saying to yourself, well, he must be spoiled that he can fall out of love with something in the hand of Abraham Lincoln. The problem with this is I think I bought it for commercial reasons. I said, well, there's a flashy name. People purchase Abraham Lincoln, and I didn't have a lot of passion for it when I bought it. And when I sat down to catalog it, I must be honest, I sort of found it utterly boring. It is an appointment of an assessor of internal revenue for the 5th collection district of California. And maybe it's nice to have a California connection to Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps that's scarce. But what could I say about an assessor of the Internal Revenue Department that really didn't appeal to me? So now I have to sort of catalog and sell this item because, of course, every book business needs cash flow, but I have to do so without a lot of the passion that I really want to put into the items I sell. So unfortunately, this is a fine document, but one that I fell out of love with, and I hope I've explained those reasons why. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you will tune in for other episodes, about the rare book world. And of course, do hit subscribe. I certainly need subscribers to boost visibility. So I appreciate that, and take care.